Recently, while catching up with a friend, he shared a conversation that left a lasting impression. His cousin, as he was telling me, had just graduated from high school, and after the celebrations settled down, he was sitting at breakfast with his mom. And with a casual tone of curiosity, he said, "Hey Mom, now that I'm out of the house and you're an empty nester, are you and Dad getting a divorce?" Welcome to How Not to Retire, the podcast where we explore how to make the most out of your encore years, not just financially, but emotionally, socially, and mentally. Episode 42, The Gray Divorce. Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Richard Himmer. Today, we're discussing something that gets very little attention, yet is very concerning. It's the shocking rise in what is termed gray divorce. Folks age 50 and older are divorcing at twice the rate, and retirees age 65 and older are at 3 times the rate, and this is going back for the last 30 years. I'll get back a little bit to those numbers, but first let's finish the dialogue between our recent high school graduate and his mom. Remember, they were having breakfast when he asked her if she and her husband were getting a divorce now that they were empty nesters. His question came as a surprise to the mom, not because of any ongoing conflict, but precisely because there wasn't. His parents got along great and communicated openly. The family was still close. The siblings, who had already started their own family, were all still in touch. Naturally, his mother was curious and asked where such an idea came from. The young man explained that several of his friends' parents had recently divorced, and many of them said they waited until their children were grown before separating, believing it was finally time to live their own lives. This story reflects a growing societal trend that has captured the attention of researchers and families alike: gray divorce. As more couples over the age of 50 end their marriages, even in the absence of overt conflict, questions arise about what causes these late life separations and whether they can be prevented. Understanding the emotional, psychological, and relational dynamics behind gray divorce is kind of important, not only for those experiencing it, but also for those hoping to maintain a lasting connection in the later stages of life. In recent decades, divorce among older adults has become increasingly common, giving rise to what sociologists and psychologists refer to as the gray divorce, as alluded to earlier. This term typically describes the dissolution of marriages involving those 50 plus who have gray hair. According to the Pew Research Center, the divorce rate for adults over 50 has roughly doubled since the 90s, and for those over 65, the rates tripled, and that research was done in 2017. I wonder what it is now, specifically since COVID. These separations present a distinct challenge, particularly as those going through them intersect with retirement, their health issues, and the natural evolving family dynamics. So what's different with younger couples? Their divorces often revolve around child custody or career changes, infidelity, different addictive type behaviors. Older individuals have a whole different set of challenges. Retirement removes the structure of daily work life. That's our start. And it frequently leaves couples with more time together. That is the problem. But they have fewer distractions. So, simultaneously, they've got financial anxieties in some, health concerns in most, and the empty nest transition strains emotional bonds, specifically if those bonds were never really intertwined as a couple, but more as two individual people living separate lives in the same home. Couples who once felt stable may find that their shared goals or interests may have diverged years ago, but they never really had time to talk about it because they were so busy being in their own independent worlds, somewhat like two silos in a larger silo. The rising prevalence of gray divorce can be attributed, according to some of the research, to a combination: social, emotional, and practical. And those practical things specifically impact the couples as they age. while younger couples may separate due to simple disagreements over child rearing, as mentioned, the infidelity earlier on, which is becoming more and more rampant, career pressures, older couples encounter the more subtle, cumulative challenges that develop over decades of shared life, with the compounding aspect of anger or frustration or holding a grudge. One major contributor to the Great Divorce is the evolving nature of our society and the expectations. In previous generations, marriage was often viewed as a lifelong commitment, irrespective of personal satisfaction. Today, many older adults, particularly baby boomers, who came of age during, and this will help explain it, during women's lib, the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s, the free love, they prioritize personal fulfillment and emotional well-being over the traditional bonds of a commitment made. As a result, individuals in their 50s and 60s and beyond may feel more empowered to leave marriages that no longer bring them any joy or companionship. Retirement's usually a tipping point here for many couples transitioning from full-time work to spending most days together at home can literally be the straw that breaks the camel's back. The long-standing communication issues or the always present emotional distance but never really talked about become dividing factors. The structure and identity provided by work often conceal deeper relational problems. When that structure disappears, when they retire, when they're no longer going to work every day, couples are compelled to confront the reality of their relationship, but without the comorbid distractions, if you will. As one study noted, the retirement transition can either deepen intimacy, and that's what we hope it does, or heighten dissatisfaction, depending on how couples navigate the adjustment. And I would argue, and perhaps they went in deeper on the research, but I would argue that when people divorce at that late stage because of a compounding issue, this probably started early on in their marriage but was never addressed. Financial strain is another significant factor. Contrary to popular belief, retirement doesn't always bring retirement ease or financial ease, and that, for many of you listening, will already know that. Adjusting to a fixed income, managing healthcare expenses, or planning for long-term care often creates tension between spouses and family, their children, for example. Disagreements over budgeting, the debt, support for older children or grandchildren erodes trust and cooperation, especially if you're supporting someone and the couple doesn't necessarily agree. It's going to lead to more marital dissatisfaction. The emotional impact of an empty nest, well, it's going to be profound. For decades, many couples centered their lives around raising the children. For many, especially boomers and even a little bit older, the mother's identity was about raising the children. But what happens when the kids are gone? What happens when she wants to go and have her own career? What happens when she goes back to school? The dynamics between the husband and the wife are different. The dynamics as a mother and father are also different. And then you got to bring in the idea that once you lose that unifying role as a parent, well, what are your shared interests and values? So what happens during that time frame is there feelings of purposelessness, estrangement come within the relationship. And then there's the health-related issues that further complicates the situation. As couples age, one partner might take on the role of a caregiver due to chronic illness or physical decline, while caregiving can be an expression of love. It can also lead to burnout, resentment, and imbalance, especially if the support is either insufficient, so the resentment comes from the one who's ill, or what if the one who's not ill never felt like he or she had a voice before, and now all of a sudden they're having to give up what could be an encore set of years just to take care of the person to whom they feel resentment toward. In some instances, This leads alone just through the separation, the divorce, and then they bring in family dynamics. The children start getting involved, and I'm going to mention this in a little bit, but then the children feel like they're obligated to take a side. These factors create a very complex picture of what it looks like when great divorces happen. It's rarely the result of a single event. It's often the result of a compounding series of events, and it reflects on this accumulation of unmet emotional needs. Perhaps it was lifestyle changes and evolving personal goals. Recognizing these issues early, starting much sooner than 5 years before you're going to retire or even in the retirement years, can help you get through the communication and mutual understandings that need to happen in order to prevent this drift, if you will. And so often this drift is very quiet, and that leads to a late life separation, and too many people don't see it coming. Some gray divorces, while they end in legal separations or separate households, that's the one we're measuring. The one that I was curious about, and I did a little research on this, is what I call the invisible divorce. An invisible divorce happens when couples remain under the same roof but experience little to no emotional or physical connection. They may no longer argue or engage in meaningful conversations, but instead they're just going to coexist in parallel routines, disconnected from the intimacy and support that were once central to the relationship. Earlier I mentioned about the silo effect, and this is kind of what I was alluding to. This form of detachment often develops gradually, obscured by decades of shared responsibilities, child-rearing, or work-related distractions. In retirement, however, the absence of external obligations really exposes the work-related distractions. Without the buffer of busy schedules, the silence, and the lack of affection, it becomes increasingly more difficult to ignore such things going on. So for some, living in an invisible divorce can feel lonelier than the actual solitude, because it's going to highlight as a memory every time you see the person that lost sense of partnership while preserving the facade of marriage. Invisible divorce not only contributes to late life separations, but it also takes a toll on mental and emotional health, making it a critical yet often overlooked aspect of the gray divorce phenomenon. Divorce at any age carries emotional weight. I'm not trying to discount it from when they were younger, but when you're older, the psychological impact can be uniquely profound. After decades of shared history, routines, and identity as a couple, the end of a long-term marriage often prompts a period of emotional upheaval that challenges one's sense of self, security, and even belonging. One of the most immediate effects is a heightened risk of depression and anxiety. And as in podcasts gone by, I've highlighted many times the various areas that we need to focus on to avoid the risk of depression and anxiety. So according to a study in the Journal of Gerontology, adults over 50 who experience a divorce face significantly higher levels of psychological distress compared to their married counterparts, and that research was conducted in 2019. The loss of a partner, especially one who has been integral to everyday rituals and long-term memories, can lead to feelings of grief, failure, and a fear about tomorrow, about the future. This emotional shock can be intensified by the perceived narrowing of opportunities for new relationships, or perhaps a personal reinvention in later life. Social isolation, and I kind of alluded to that also earlier, it's another common consequence. Married life often offers built-in companionship and social engagement. Remember, we've mentioned it. We're hardwired to connect. We're not hardwired. We're not even designed. First of all, we're not designed to live alone. We're not designed to be isolated. Secondly, we're truly not designed to retire. In other words, to quit doing everything. Retirement, in our definition, is simply no longer working in your primary source of income, but that you move into different areas of focus and passions and hobbies. So as mentioned, These studies link loneliness in older adults to increased risks of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and premature mortality. None of that sounds very fun. And then there's always the family dynamics, particularly in relationships with adults, children, and grandchildren. These children may feel compelled to choose sides, or they might struggle with feelings of being betrayed. Definitely, confusion will abound. And even decades after leaving the family home, there's going to be a challenge. In so many years of coaching families in this area, it's amazing how profound the relationship of the grandpa and grandma couple, has a huge impact on the happiness, joy, and well-being of their children and their grandchildren. Great divorce is not merely a legal or a logistical event. It represents a profoundly emotional experience, and it's going to disturb one's inner life and social world. Recognizing these effects is pretty important, both in healing after the divorce, but more important, proactively addressing potential marital breakdowns before they ever happen. And that's where the role of emotional intelligence comes in. EI plays a very important role in sustaining relationships over time, particularly during the transitions and stressors that accompany aging. Now, it's not a static issue, EI isn't. It can be learned. And since it's only been around for 30 years, roughly, that we've talked about it much, perhaps many of those in the listening audience have heard of it, but never gotten into the weeds with it. They don't really understand the definition of EI, emotional intelligence, and what that means. So just a quick synopsis. EI is the ability to recognize, understand, manage, and express one's emotions, while also being attuned to the emotions of others. Emotional intelligence equips couples with tools to navigate the interpersonal challenges that arise later in life. In the context of great divorce, EI can serve as both a buffer against conflict and a bridge towards deeper emotional connection. Now, I'm going to take a side note here and just share anecdotally from my experiences in coaching couples and coaching couples who are 50 and more. Too often when this happens, and I'll stereotype it, but it doesn't mean it's always this way, the couple will come in and he's brought in dragging his feet. He does not want to be there. She wants to be there because she wants to keep it together. And she realizes that, well, one of two things. One, she realizes that both of them need to change. Too often, and this is challenging, she just wants him to change because she thinks he's the problem, but that's neither here nor there. The challenge is one or both of them are going to think they already know. So let me go back and define it again. It is defined as the ability to recognize and understand. And almost every person will say, yeah, I already understand that. I already know what that is. But here's where the crutch comes in. Manage. No, they're not doing that at all. They wouldn't be in my office. And express one's emotions in a healthy way. No, they don't do that either. So they have 2 out of 4, but I'd argue that knowledge isn't power. So they might know about it, they might have heard of it, they might have read a book, they might have even just listened to a podcast. But the capacity to apply emotional intelligence and effective communication skills does not come from a book or from a podcast or hearing people talk about it. The reality is most people don't know what they're doing out there. They don't know who they are. They walk around aimlessly, and this is before they hit retirement. So I'm going to go back into EI. The most important tenet of EI is self-awareness, seeing what's going on, noticing it. How are you responding? How is that impacting you? As individuals age, they experience shifts in identity, purpose, and energy levels. The challenge is they oftentimes go to sleep at the wheel, metaphorically speaking. They think they've already done everything. They think they already know everything. But the world around them is changing so fast, what they thought 10 minutes ago is already wrong because they based it on a false assumption. Being aware of one's emotional needs, communicating them clearly, reduces the likelihood of unmet expectations and that ever-building and compounding silent resentment. When both parties are self-aware, They can articulate their boundaries and desires much more effectively, thus creating space for a mutual position of growth instead of this emotional stagnation, which is kind of the foundation of to why they're either in an invisible divorce or they experience a gray divorce. Another core component of emotional intelligence is regulating your emotions, the ability to manage negative feelings such as frustration, disappointment, resentment, and I would often throw in there judging. When we get older, you know as well as I do, it's so easy for us to judge the younger generation. Well, when I was that age, well, you're not that age, and you do not know what it's like for them to go through it, and you can't even imagine being in their shoes. That doesn't help at all because you're going to bias your imagination. The idea behind understanding how to regulate your emotions means you first see them, and then you learn how to regulate it so you don't fall into cycles of blame, withdrawal, passive aggressiveness, the victim trap, the mentality of woe is me, I'm helpless, powerless, hopeless, or persecutor, or perhaps even rescuer. The most important one, or the most difficult one, the most important one is self-awareness, but the most challenging one is empathy. Now, empathy, I'm not going to describe it by Webster's or what you grew up thinking empathy was. That's not really accurate. Empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective, feelings, through their eyes, not yours. You don't bring yourself into it. Empathy, by Webster's definition, and those of you who probably think you already know, means that you're going to relate to someone. I can relate what you're going through. I can put myself in your position. But that's not neutral. Practicing empathy reduces, if not eliminates, defensiveness, and it fosters a sense of being heard. In other words, when you're empathetic, you bring safe space into the conversation, and the partner, the spouse, the loved one, whether it's a child, a grandchild, or your spouse, is going to feel different when they know they've been heard. That's empathy. And empathy gets coupled with effective communication. This is a skill deeply rooted in emotional intelligence, and it's even more critical the older you get. With children grown and work obligations almost reduced or eliminated, couples usually find themselves spending this unstructured time together. Without healthy communication patterns, this increases the shared time, and that exacerbates this dynamics of their relationship. How many times have you heard the joke about when the husband retires, the wife after 3 days asking him to go get another job? They don't have the skills. They haven't worked on it. Now, it's cute and it's kind of funny at first, but it's not so funny 2 years later when they both get divorced or they both enact their invisible divorce. Research supports a link between emotional intelligence and marital quality. In a study conducted, they found that individuals with higher emotional intelligence report greater relationship satisfaction. There should be no surprise there. EI is not a fixed trait. It can be developed. And early studies showed that when you hit about 40 or 50, you kind of peak on your emotional intelligence, your EQ or your quotient, right? But that doesn't necessarily have to be. As I mentioned, it's not a fixed trait. And as we've talked about in your encore years, this is your bonus half of life. This is when you can learn things you didn't know before. You can be aware of things you never saw before. So in the face of retirement, empty nests, and evolving roles, emotional intelligence is quite important. It's both a preventive and a healing function. It empowers couples not only to manage conflict, but to also become closer during life's inevitable transitions. These encore years can be your best. What if you actually studied communication skills? What if you got to know your wife? Quick story. I was with a couple. They were in their mid-50s. They'd been married for 30 years plus. And as we sat down, I was teaching them what I'm sharing with you right now. And keep in mind, this was almost 20 years ago. And I'll never forget the husband looking at me and saying, he looked at me and he was really mad at me. And he says, I don't need to learn any of this stuff you're telling me. I already know my wife. I've been with her for 30 years, for crying out loud. What I didn't say to him and what I thought of was how much he didn't know, because I had just done a 15-minute interview with his wife. and I probably knew more about his wife in 15 minutes than he knew in 30 plus years. Because according to her, and I'm not doubting what she had to say after watching him get angry at me after just 5 minutes in the office, he never really cared about her. He never really talked to her. It was always about him, and he was very judgmental and condescending. Now, I'm not expecting because someone hears a podcast that you're going to run out and change, especially if that someone is you that I'm describing, because you're probably not going to want to look in the mirror. You're probably going to think it's rubbish. You're probably going to blame someone else or shame-base them. And then you're going to go about being miserable and acting out in a dysfunctional way for the rest of your life. But what you're not seeing is the sheer trouble and challenges and the time and the energy that it's going to require for your loved ones to take care of all the messes that you make. I'm just simply saying, if you want to find a little bit of happiness in your bonus years, learn how to effectively communicate. Learn how to listen. Learn how to eliminate judging from your repertoire. Learn how to realize that nobody cares about you really and all the complaints that you do. Your grandchildren don't care. They're just being nice. Your children are tired of them. They've heard them their entire lives. What if you turned over a new leaf? What if you learned the skills of effectively communicating? What if you learned how to be empathetic? What if you learned what makes your kids tick and what makes your grandchildren tick? Now, I could go into all the financial stuff, but it's not that important for right now. Divorces primarily do not happen because of money. They happen because of a lack of communication. They happen because we don't have any emotional intelligence skills. The Great Divorce is a growing phenomenon. It reflects much deeper shifts in societal norms, personal expectations, and the lived experiences of aging couples. As the number of older couples opting to end long-term marriages continues to rise, it becomes increasingly important to understand the underlying causes and emotional consequences of this trend. From emotional disconnection and invisible divorce to the pressures of retirement and the financial strains, the challenges older couples face are complex. They're cumulative, they compound, and yet despite all of this, it's not an inevitable outcome. As we've shown before, emotional intelligence can have a profound impact to the positive if you practice and learn skills such as empathy, self-awareness, effective communication, self-regulation. Because if not, the later stages of life when your identity and purpose and routine carry such a significant transformation, well, that's why we're getting the divorces, because people do not know how to handle it. Above all, this journey we're going through, these golden years, these encore years, if you will, they're meant to be growing together, not growing apart. With awareness, effort, and a shared commitment to growth, couples certainly can navigate this stage with a renewed connection. While the rise in Great Divorce highlights real and pressing relationship challenges, it also presents an opportunity to reimagine aging not as a time of loss, but as a chance to deepen intimacy, rediscover shared purpose, and build this lasting legacy together. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of How Not to Retire. If you found today's discussion valuable, I ask you to share it with a friend and keep this conversation going. And as always, remember, don't try harder, try different.